Such a smooth start. Such a smooth
Oh,
start.
it's fine. It's all good. This is live stuff. So, Tamara, you can hear me, right?
I hear you just fine.
Okay. Good. Good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome from the heart of Central Texas. It's Tuesday night, and this is Breaking the Chain. We are broadcasting all across the world over to viewers who have registered for this event. They're still populating into the room at this time. As of right now, we're looking at a count of about 82 participants, and the number is rising. And thank you all for joining in. Tonight, we're going to have Tamara Griffin here, and she's going to talk about some issues with mechanics in the past. And so we'll go through our little intro here. Just give me a moment. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right. Breaking the chain. That mechanic tried to kill me. All right. So this is a All-American Aviation YouTube / Breaking the Chain event. And my name is Jeremy Walters. I am a professional pilot, ATP airplane. I'm working on ATP helicopter. I just got designated as a master CFI about 3 weeks ago. And it's the first time I've been designated as a master CFI. And this program has actually had a part in me getting to that point. It's an honor to be able to be an aviation mentor. And I couldn't do it without the help of many, many people along the way. And I want to thank all of you who have helped participate and make this program successful, and all of the students that have that I've been able to mentor along the way, who have also helped me be successful. I'm a major in the United States Army Reserves. I flew 864s, or the Apache Longbow, while I was on active duty, and I love teaching float planes. I love teaching private through CFI. If I can teach it, I love doing it. I love being involved in educating people in aviation. And I mentioned earlier, I'm a YouTuber, content creator. The YouTube channel is just one method of reaching a vast audience around the world to help get the message out. I could not do any of this without the support of my beloved family. That's my wife, Talia, our 5 kids, and my beautiful Luscombe 8E, Miss Betsy Blue, in the background. Paul is a tremendous asset and assistant to my program. He's an instrument-rated private pilot, just got himself a 182 RG. It's still in the process of acquiring, and he participates in angel flight activities prior to COVID. And he was a Desert Storm vet in the U.S. Navy. Don't hold it against him that he was in the Navy. Tonight, we have a friend of ours from North Texas, Tamara Griffin. She's going to bring us a presentation called That Mechanic Tried to Kill Me. And she is a CFI, ATP, AMP, IA. Her mother was an aviator. She got involved in aviation, soloed at 16, got her pilot certificate at 17, CFI, II, MEI, so on and so on thereafter. In her early 20s, she's got 3 kids that are in 6 kids, but 3 of them are in aviation. One of them is already a pilot, an instructor, and the other 2 has already soloed and working on their private pilot certificates. And she's just immersed in aviation. She's a terrific mentor and owns a school up in North Texas. So tonight, it is my distinct honor to introduce our special guest speaker, Miss Tamara Griffin. Tamara, you have the flight controls.
Well, that's a scary thought. I have the
I know. Just kidding. We got to have some fun, right?
we should all be very afraid when I take the flight controls. Great introduction there, Jeremy and Paul. Great to see you too. Look forward to seeing that 182 when you're all finished with it. And welcome to That Mechanic Tried to Kill Me. This is actually And originally, something that started with my mom back in the day, she started this program, and I've added to her original talk on That Mechanic Tried to Kill Me. So some of these are her stories, and then there's my stories and other stories that I've learned over the years. So without further ado, I have a PowerPoint, and I will share my screen so you can see all of what I'm going to show you. Let's see if I can get this to work right tonight. And do we see everything? That
Perfect.
mechanic.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So first day of 2020 is doing good. Welcome to That Mechanic Tried to Kill Me, my compilation of the mechanic-induced troubles. And let's see if we go to, oops, wrong one. Go the right direction. This works. It says it's all human errors. Everything, the majority are always related to probably negligence, but complacency also, simple mistakes from distractions, a variety of things, or a lack of skill or knowledge that comes in that. And then some of it is outright misconduct or falsified work, forgery in the logbooks, variety of things. And I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've probably been involved in many of the same things, if not guilty of a few of them myself. And as any mechanic, we're always learning. We just want to know which is the right course to learn. I like to have fun. So who are these mechanics I'm always discussing? Most of them are probably certified A&Ps, airframe and power plant, and or IAs, also as inspection authorized mechanics. Some of you are home builders or cheap owners or just owners, and others are apprentices and or school trained mechanics. So these are some of you that maybe without the information you're used to, they don't have the knowledge that we're expecting. So moving on to the next one. So mistakes or negligence are probably your most common thing. So we're starting with this cotter pin. Simplified mistake, you can put this cotter pin in, you maybe fought it for 30 minutes trying to get it in the right place because it's in a hidden hole, and then somebody asks for your attention, something, and you walk away and you forget to go back and finish moving the cotter pin so that it won't fall out. Could be simple from wiring, shimmy dampeners, putting safety wire on a brake pad. Anything is simple or unintentional negligence mistakes. True negligence is usually leading up to just ignoring the problem because, well, I got it in this far, we're good to go. We all know those people. We're probably all guilty of that at some point in something we do in our lives. I take the stop, got to take a Mother Nature break. And, that's when I'm going to miss a few screws in the inspection panel, or I'm going to end up leaving a rag. And some people leave random tools in airplanes. I can't tell you how many tools I've collected over the years. It's kind of fun sometimes. But these are all common human errors. But the mechanics we sometimes consider inept in this. It's really, they're making typical mistakes we all make. But sometimes it's truly inept mistakes that you just go, why do you not care about what we're doing? Like safety wiring. This next one's kind of fun. You look to the left of your screen there's that beautiful one here. Looks really good, except they missed the hole by one little bit. Okay, like it's safety to itself. I don't know where you're going to go or not go with that one. They tried. We'll give them that credit. They did try. Or then they go to the next one. Did they really try? Because the idea it's supposed to always tighten and there's supposed to be so many loops. You got to wonder about the mechanic who thought this was good enough. Most of the time, safety wire is not hypercritical because it's designed to break, but it's designed to prevent catastrophic failure in a lot of ways so that you would catch it early. But if you don't catch it early or you do it poorly, it could lead to problems. Where it's hyper effective is probably on a prop bolt or something critical like that. or maybe a drain plug on your oil, because who wants to lose all their oil in a hurry? And then there's this next safety wire. What the F? We don't know what somebody was thinking. There's this beautiful safety wire-ish going all sorts of ways. Great artistic. I'm just not sure it's functional. So moving on. And pilots and mechanics can relate to this quote. Don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. Pilots, like mechanics, we make mistakes, and try not to spend forever trying to rationalize or justify it. And one will likely notice mechanics, like pilots, hate being told they've screwed up. And we will spend an inordinate amount of time, defending our screw ups. And I don't think any of us are not guilty of this occasionally, because we don't like to be wrong. Mechanics are probably high on that list, as well as the captain that you fly with. You may be the captain for all I know. And we can start with pilots and mechanics, making their screw ups. I'm going to confess this is partly my screw up. So it started with a Cessna 152. I removed a carburetor because it was overdue for an overhaul. We pulled it off, sent it off to the shop. No big deal. We stick a new carb. The carb in the picture is not representative of the actual carb on the 152, just in case somebody wants to be that technical. But you see in the circle this little discharge tube that from the accessory, and it discharged extra fuel into the carburetor. So it's circled there. This is important to know because it was installed on the new carb, and it was there in the new carb. But at some point, after probably 10 or so hours of flight time after this new carb was put on, we had a stuck throttle, wide open. And I was also with a brand spanking new student who was really on her first lesson. So very interestingly enough, we're dealing with an interesting problem. For me, it was no big deal. It wasn't even, I wouldn't have considered it an emergency because I know, one, you could shut the engine off. I was lazy and said, I'll just play with the mixture because I don't want to have to hand pull the airplane. We didn't have a tug for it back then, all the way to the hangar once I land this airplane. But I was prepared, of course. If I couldn't do that, I can land it, obviously, with no power. We landed, and I was able to play with the mixture. Shortly after shutdown, we played with the throttle. Guess what? It moves freely now. And I'm over here going, what the F? We immediately pull the air box off, which you see in the bottom right corner. Good. And you see the little screen, and I pull it off, and we shake it around multiple times, put it back on. We probably shook it around multiple times when we replaced the carb because we never really disconnected it from the major cables. Shoved it back on and couldn't find it. And multiple times, we even saw evidence up in the little butterfly here that something was caught in there. So we knew we had something. Shook it around multiple times, and somewhere inside that little grid, we finally noticed, probably after about the third or fourth time of removing that carb box, there was something a little extra inside the wiring that didn't fit the rest of the lines. It was actually just angled perfectly where we could actually see it for the first time. Found one of these little jets. First thing I did is looked up the original carb, the current carb. It's still there, so that's not the one that's missing. That led to, okay, how did that get into my airbox, and what did I do to cause that part to be floating around in my part? So this is my complacency, not checking the airbox properly when I replaced the carb. But it was a falsified record that led to this carb issue. So you look up in the top corner there's a whole bag of parts. The original carb that I took to the overhaul shop, they gave me back this entire baggie of parts, which is not common for a lot of shops to do. And with that, they gave me this baggie of and I could see the plastic float, and I could see all these other parts. And I didn't think much about it at the time, other than we were darn lucky that we never had a real actual issue. This is an AD on these carbs to replace that plastic float along with the jets and stuff, so that you don't have a loss of power, especially on takeoff, which happened to a lot of people. And takeoff loss of power is not a good thing in a 152, by the way. So I felt lucky at the time, but I didn't think much about it beyond that, because it was stamped on the side of the carb as part of it saying it was done, as well as the logbooks indicated this particular AD was done. Obviously, it was not done. So back to my previous carb, I'm finding extra parts in my airbox. I pull this baggie out, and sure enough, nowhere in this bigger picture you see that little tube. And that was what was the missing item. And we found it in our airbox, and probably in one of my stall practices, it floated just perfectly inside that butterfly and caused that throttle to be stuck wide open. Fun times, but no problem. That student went on to further, their education. So, but it was amazing how many times that led to the problem. But the falsified records gets me every time. So I was really irritated, and we were very lucky during check rides and solo students. We never had an actual failure with the original carb. I'm not as worried about a throttle stuck open, other than we're going to have to shut the engine off if it was a solo student. But that's what I teach them good for. More examples of falsified records. I haven't seen this one in particular. Somebody showed me this one and I kept it. A magneto signed off for over 58 years of annual inspections. Okay, most magnetos need about every 1,000 hours inspection, and there's usually a 500 hour. It depends. Okay, pilots and mechanics, we're all guilty of this one thing. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't look at it. I get that. Trust me, I get it 100%. But some things do need to be looked at, as we can see a lot of things in there that's probably not a good look. Good point. I just collected the pictures. I've seen alternators not signed off, and they've been checked or they've been redone at some local alternator shop. They're not done at, they're not the approved ones. Starters the same way. 30 years of flying and this starter's never been changed. I'm not quite buying this. We've all seen it. We probably have bought an old airplane. Guess what? You're gonna see this. It is kind of fun. Oops, I screwed up my paperwork here. Get my notes right. Because got to turn the page over. Sorry, my bad. And bag of parts. And then we go to the next scene. So this is something that happened to let me back it up. I screwed up. We see the pulley over here with the cable. Now, this is a tie wrap, and someone has done something in particular, but it reminded me the first time I'd seen it was a story my mom had. I had grown up with this story all my life. And so it probably it affected my flying more than it affected my maintenance work at the time. She was teaching in 1975 as a flight instructor, but she was teaching in a 1971 172. So for that day and time, that's practically a new 172, because I'm flying the same airplanes at the same age. Here we are 30, 40 years later. Something says a lot about the age of that airplane. But she's in this, 172 that their Cessna back in 72, 73 had produced these service bulletins for a bracket to keep the cable from lifting off of that pulley you see. And this one is not installed in the airplane. I did not have a good picture to demonstrate, but it was something that Cessna and not only sent the part to the owners of these airplanes, but they sent a postcard that you would sign saying you've installed this part and send it back. So whoever was the previous owner prior to the flight school she worked for owned it, sent this card in. Turned out they apparently never did install the actual bracket, even though they probably still had it in their drawer somewhere. They stuck it in their toolbox. I'll bet you some mechanic has it in his toolbox to this day. But in 1975, she was out. She climbed up to an extra 1,000 feet above her normal altitude to practice stalls that day with a student. And during one of the stall recoveries, the student was unable to pull the yoke back in order to start the recovery. And of course, she takes over the plane. She also cannot start to pull back. She could not pull the plane up. The yoke is locked in place. So she hits the trim tab, she spins the trim, and that's how she recovers from the stall, by trim only. Scary thought, really. Luckily, they're on separate cables, obviously. So she runs this trim and she finally gets the airplane down on the ground, landing by trim only. And they find that this cable has come off and gotten in the pulley onto the side. Now, the reason for the bracket was because after about 4 to 5 years, these cables on your new airplanes are going to stretch. And that was their reason for putting the bracket in, is to prevent this float. So at the time, I'm sure the owner thought it's not a big deal, so we don't need it. And then he sold the airplane a couple of years later to this flight school. So the flight school was not complicit in this case, but they were going to eat that really quick if they weren't careful. Luckily, she got it on the ground. She had been taught how to use trim, and that's when they discovered this problem. And then though the logbooks and Cessna's information, that bracket had been installed. By the way, I told you she went up an extra 1,000 feet, right? She rolled out with that trim 500 foot AGL above the ground. She barely recovered, if you think about it. If she'd been at the normal altitude, she would not have recovered that airplane. And I would have not had a mother anymore. So she didn't try to kill me directly, but that mechanic tried to kill me, or at least tried to kill my mom. Shortly then, many years later, my mom was flying a Navajo with my dad, and they fly corporate a lot. And she went to go pick up this Navajo, and I don't have the original Navajo, obviously, a picture, but I found a picture, not a great picture, of where the indicator for the trim is, right there with the little arrows pointing. The mechanic told her when she picked it up, he adjusted the trim indicator, not the trim, but the trim indicator on the Navajo, because it was so hard to see. What a concept, so hard to see. So without checking what it's doing on the outside, he takes apart it internally, fix the indicator so it's showing neutral, even if the controls outside are not neutral. And if anybody's ever flown a Navajo for a twin, it's extremely heavy. So depending on where the controls were, not knowing that, a pilot would not have either been able to pull that airplane up, or it would have been stuck in such enough up trim they probably couldn't have put it nose down enough to prevent a stall. It would have been a stall that, and it would have been pilot error, even though it was a mechanic induced error. Luckily, somebody happened to mention it to her, so she was able to get that fixed before she attempted a flight. Another one of those. I'm really glad. I was probably a teenager at the time, but it still would have been heartbreaking to lose my mother at that age. So, moving on. Mechanics are, we think, is our biggest problems, but sometimes it's the owners. I found this cartoon based on another fatality, obviously, and they were talking about, something about not being replaced and not a bad leak. Owners notoriously can be cheap. Hey, I get it. Aviation's expensive, right? I mean, Paul can tell you how expensive his 182 is probably turning into, but that's part of our, that's part of what it is. That we're going to pay that price one way or another. Like the previous slide said, if you think it's expensive now, wait till you hire, a bad mechanic. But owners would love to tell mechanics, don't fix it, don't do this, don't do that. It'll wait till another time. So while I don't have any information on this particular incident, I did take note, and that leads us into owners can be the bad mechanics also. This one includes my daughter. Note down at the very bottom, there's a beautiful girl standing next to a beautiful airplane, a little tri-pacer. And this was on her 16th birthday when she had soloed that along with 4 other airplanes. And it was a great flying little tri-pacer. I loved flying that little tri-pacer all day long. But after a couple of years, it turned into what you see above it, and you see the aftermath of it landing in a field. This was the owner who hired a dangerous mechanic, I would call it. It was we'll go back to my notes to get this correct. She had soloed in 2009, and in 2011 there is an NTSB report for this particular tri-pacer, and I and another mechanic had noticed a fuel leak in this airplane probably a few months prior to this fire damage. We informed the owner, but he didn't really want it fixed then. We did do some other maintenance to it at the time, and we only signed off exactly that maintenance for that reason, because he refused to deal with the problem. Fuel leaks obviously are bad. Any fuel leaks near an exhaust system, twice as bad, right? But he did want an annual. We of course was not going to do the annual. He hired somebody, and we're just going to call this person. He had another nickname, and Dangerous was the first name. But I'm going to use a different name called Dangerous John. We're going to call him Dangerous John. So Dangerous John signed off an annual. Dangerous John, by the way, is no longer an active mechanic. He is beyond retirement. I'm not even sure if he's still alive at this point. It's been many years. But he had signed this off probably a matter of 2 or 3 months prior to this incident occurring. The owner of this airplane didn't want any of these leaks fixed. That's why he hired Dangerous John, who was willing to sign just about anything. Obviously, he was willing to sign anything. And the owner was out flying in this airplane, probably 500 foot or less, because they were out checking the cows with his friend. They put it, and then the owner noticed that his feet were getting really, really warm. Don't think it had anything to do with cabin heat. He did check all that, and he realized that his engine was on fire and it was starting to break through the firewall. This is a fabric airplane, for those who are not aware of what a tri-pacer is. So fabric and fire is usually not a good combination anyways. Metal, at least you stand a chance. So he's dealing with the fire. He puts it down on the ground very, very quickly. He does get, I believe, a 3rd-degree burn through his work boot. He was a farmer, so he had these work boots on, but the passenger he had with him was not harmed in any way. They were able to escape the airplane before it was fully engulfed in flames. What is not always known in the NTSB report is his son was learning to fly this airplane. His son was supposed to be in this airplane the following day on a cross country, which would have put him about 4,000 or 5,000 feet in the air. He would not have had time to get on the ground to survive that fire. That was probably what changed this owner's mind in about not fixing some leaks, at least. He's still a bit of a cheap owner, but at least he will fix fuel leaks. We'll give him that credit. But he, that right there in 500 foot, and it didn't take probably 10 minutes for that airplane to be completely totaled as you see it is today. It sat on the field of the airport for years after that. So it made it down that, and nobody died. Nobody was seriously harmed other than a small burn on a foot. Not something that usually happens when you see an airplane engulfed in flames. And then to lighten the relativity of here, I pick on my home builders all the time. Love you guys. I have a lot of friends who fly RVs. They fly these various, home-built experimental airplanes. So I pick on you because I also occasionally do shop at Ace Aerospace Hardware. As you can see over here circled was definitely not aircraft quality to probably maybe a starter or alternator. I don't know. But it's kind of fun to pick on them, but they're not really always the worst. Home built depot, depot is what I call them. Finding interesting hardware on your airplane. You're going to find it. Let's go through Air Tractor Supply. There's actually one local to my airport, so I am in there a lot, but not for what you think. But I have actually seen this a few times, this interesting landing light. I'm still looking for the STC for this landing light install and its location, because I just never seen this on a tri-pacer before. So if somebody has that NTS or the STC, you could let me know, please. I would love it. But yes, I have actually seen quite a few interesting tractor parts on airplanes over the years. It's kind of fun. And this is on a certified one, so I can't just pick on the home builders. These are some certified airplanes like this one is, that you just go, what were you thinking? And why do you think the intake of an airplane is a good place to put a landing light? But what do I know? I'm just a mechanic. I haven't used bobby pins or hairpins for anything but mostly hair, but I've used them for other things like holding up a poster board, but not as a cotter pin, as you can see in this lovely video. Not mine, not an airplane I found. I happened to see it on the internet and went, that's interesting. So I thought everybody would enjoy that one. And then there's other repairs I've seen. These are not always all the ones I've seen. Some of them I found on the internet going, what were you people thinking? What were you thinking? I look at the rivet line going, half of them are not even actually holding anything. That's kind of fun. And then how many repairs can go on a repair, can go on a repair, can go on a repair? I'm not sure that qualifies, but it's an interesting repair. Or red RTV makes a great sealant. I agree. I'm just not sure it's good for intake. And the broke off stud for a cylinder. Yeah, I've seen something like that before, but usually we don't let it go out that way. Moving on to the next thing. Back to hardware. Beautiful Conquest in the picture. Would anybody agree? It's a Conquest 2. It's actually one my parents have flown for years. So I've gotten to know it, obviously. But a nose gear inspection led to the nose gear failure many years ago. I couldn't even tell you what year it was. So there was always a standing order for any maintenance shop for this airplane by the owners and by the pilots, who are also mechanics, by the way, that if you remove hardware, you will replace the hardware. Not a bad policy, in my opinion. That meant even the cheap hardware gets replaced as well as the expensive one. And I do have a philosophy of, if you've torqued hardware, any bolts you've torqued, you probably should replace with new when possible. Some studs and stuff, obviously, you can't just replace immediately. But anything torqued, you should consider replacing if it's possible. Because when you torque something, you've stretched it, you've weakened it, and eventually this might happen. In this case, it's a nose gear inspection that Cessna required for these Conquest. And this airplane had just went through the brand new Dash 10 STC conversions for that airplane, as well as some new props, new paint, the whole works. It just got the whole works done. So this picture is actually right after it is freshly all done. And about 100 hours after that, they had a nose gear failure. It turned out the mechanic at that shop, which is an excellent shop, by the way, but they had a bad mechanic, he had put a previously used torque bolt, and then not only torqued it, he over torqued it. So he put it in too tight. So now you stretch it, and that right there, that stretched area where it's broke, is what is common. Now, this bolt is not representative of the torque link bolts in that airplane, but it is a good representation of what occurred in that sense. And it took 100 hours for it to fail, but it could have happened at 50 hours. It might have happened at 1,000 hours. So 100 hours later, it was getting another set of engines and props. What was bad about this one was the owner of that airplane was actually on the airplane at the same time. He happened to take a picture of the 3 green lights at the same time that it all occurred. So that was kind of fun. But all in all, the shop made good, and that mechanic was tied to a couple other mistakes. He is no longer working as a mechanic at that shop, so most of us probably don't have anything to worry about. So understanding, if you're going to use proper hardware, use the proper hardware. Try not to use any used hardware where it might be critical, such as a nose gear link or a propeller, using the correct links, things like this. Big deals for us. This next one is interesting. Non-approved parts or unapproved parts. We hear this one all the time. This Baron, you can look up the NTSB report. It was out of Kickapoo Airport in Wichita Falls. This Baron went off the end of the runway. I got involved by happening to sit in on the wing safety meeting, which the owner of the pilot of this particular airplane and flight school discussed the accident. He discussed mostly about making the decisions for the accelerated stop because he was focusing on the pilot side. But the entire incident was truly mechanic induced. Very much just a mechanic induced. The airplane had just come out of a 100-hour inspection. The owner and the mechanic were taking the plane for its post-maintenance test flight before releasing it to service back to the school, which is a policy I approve of, which is what I do at my flight school, by the way. And I just happen to be the pilot and the mechanic, so I had to do both. They said the controls checked good on pre-flight. Everything moved according to what you would expect. They pulled out on the runway, started rolling down the runway. Everything's good. Got to rotation speed. The pilot's trying to pull the yoke back. By the way, the mechanic of this airplane was sitting in the airplane with him, so he's along for the ride in this case. Not very often that happens, but they pull back and nothing happens. The yoke doesn't move. They try, and you go into this what's going on mode and you don't react, by shutting things down, or really you go, what? So he's probably pulling 2 or 3, 4 times. He doesn't know. He knew he went well beyond his intended, this is where I'll shut down if something goes wrong moment, because he went into the, I don't know what's going on mode, which is normal for everybody. There's always a delay to reaction. And when he realized he's not going to be able to rotate, he finally shuts the engines off. As you can see, both props are feathered in this picture. He actually did no damage to the props. It went across a ditch and onto this highway. So at this point, the plane is still heavily damaged, though. And the controls started moving freely after this point. Well, during the FAA NTSB inspection, they found a 90-degree PVC pipe installed into the defroster hose going to the dash. This is not an approved part, by the way. There's no PVC pipes put on an airplane. The original part is the same 90-degree angle joint, but it's crushable by your hand. You can literally, even my weak little hand can crush this thing. As in the case, it apparently had come loose off of the dash, had fallen, got caught in the yoke system, and didn't allow for the pilot to pull the yoke enough to rotate. Theory was that maybe if he'd pushed the nose forward and then pulled it back, maybe it would have released it. We don't know that. And I don't know that I would have attested that theory either. But after it shook it up from bouncing through a ditch and a highway, everything worked then again. So this mechanic, luckily nobody was hurt, by the way, and this mechanic was tied to a few other issues. So right after this one, I was aware that he had to receive remedial training because he did not catch that this part was installed on the airplane as part of any of the inspections that had been done prior to even that first 100-hour inspection that we were aware of. So there was, while he was not charged with installing this part, he didn't catch it, and there was no logbook entry that anybody had ever worked on that defroster hose and put some Home Depot 90, PVC pipe into this system. Which, logbooks are great until somebody either forgets to put the thing in, or they put the wrong, or they just outright lie to you. So take everything with a grain of salt when you're looking at new airplanes or old airplanes. So duct tape. We always have enough duct tape. You can never have enough duct tape, and it'll fix it all. I think it'll hold it together. So hopefully you get a laugh at that. Back to the bolts. Both bolts on props and safety wire, if required, would be the one area that could get a pilot into more danger than a bolt, say, on a failing gear. I found this picture of a 172 that shortly after takeoff, the prop departed the aircraft without the aircraft, and due to clipping the irrigation lines while landing straight ahead, unfortunately, it flipped the aircraft, and there were minor injuries, but nobody was seriously hurt. They were treated on the scene and allowed to let go. But one could see how what would be a minor or normal emergency landing with the prop missing off your airplane could have been more serious. You can relate to a prop nearly coming off. I can relate this to a prop coming off of a Cherokee 140. Excuse me, getting a dry mouth. Give me a second. This Cherokee 140 that I'm talking about went into an extensive annual, and I mean, it was a very reputable shop that was definitely not on the cheap side. They were very proud of their service, and they had a good reason to be. But they had done this extensive annual on a Cherokee 140. It cost almost as much as the airplane itself, which was kind of mind-boggling at the time. This has been several years now. There were several parts replaced, including the prop bolts. So that's why we're leading into this. It needed new props. They were taking the prop off. We're going to order new prop bolts. They're going to torque them. They're going to do everything. They're doing everything exactly right. They order the parts according to the books, apparently. The new bolts, when they were received, were not compared to the original bolts. Now, if any of you have been into a lot of maintenance shops, you know us mechanics, we're a bit like hoarders. We keep all the old parts. And a little bit of that is so that we compare the old part with the new part to be sure they look right and they look similar enough to put back together. And in this case, maybe it was a little bit of complacency. Some time had lapsed between ordering the parts and time they got them, and they went on to other jobs. And there's no one thought to go check because they assumed they're going to be right. Anybody can be complacent like that. I have been that way. Any one of us have done that. And so they didn't compare. And in subsequent flights, there was an instructor with this person, of the owner of the airplane, learning to fly his airplane. They were prepping for a check ride. By the way, it was my mom going to be giving that check ride at the time. People on the ground did hear an odd noise from the aircraft when it was flying just above the airport, but nobody really thought much about it, including the DPE at the time. And so upon landing, though, and taxied up to the terminal building, they shut down. This huge cloud of aluminum dust covers the cowling of the airplane. That instructor got out, and he's pretty upset. He's also a mechanic, so he's got some idea what just happened. They were able to take that prop and shake it back and forth by hand, probably moving it quarter of an inch, half an inch. I don't know. They didn't say. They just knew they could move it a lot by the hand. Something your prop should not do. They called the shop. They asked them, since you put the wrong parts on, they immediately defended themselves. Go back to that quote. They did happen to keep the old bolts, though. So they brought them to the airport. They brought them to that airplane. They pulled the new bolts. They pulled the old bolts out and compared the two and found out the shaft of thread links were different. And because of that, whether it was a part number got changed and was not addressed when they ordered the part, or maybe they were shipped the wrong part. We don't know that for sure. I never learned if they determined one way or the other. They just dealt with it, got the right part, put this airplane back together before it got bad. You could imagine on a check ride, that would not have been a fun check ride, or even after the check ride. But they did not spend a lot of time thinking about their mistake. They wanted to fix it, and they got it fixed correctly in this case. You can see in a couple of the pictures, the top picture there, where the shank is a little longer in one than the other one, and the others that look fairly normal. I would say the bottom picture, those are probably all exactly the same, but you can see how you might mistake it from the wrong angle. So that's, maintenance. That was a complacency, probably still a human error, but we are what we are. So even the best shop can get into that kind of trouble. Now we move on now and address this percentage. You see there it says 44% of the prop failure accidents are in the home built experimental. That may have to do with the willingness to use maybe not the proper grade bolts, or not use the proper hardware links, or willing to adjust outside of what is recommended. And I would highly suggest to my favorite home builders and experimental owners to really consider what is recommended for this prop, what is recommended, and if you don't know or not even sure because you're combining so many things, find an expert in the engineering world that can tell you what is a little better to lead the least amount of damage to your airplane over time. And anything with a variable pitch, now you're dealing with the hubs going bad, not just the prop bolts going bad, but a hub itself that holds it having some sort of weak area. And this is actually an AD on several certified airplanes, several variable pitch hubs, where they have to be inspected for cracks because they might lose a blade. And the last thing you want is a blade coming through an airplane or departing and shaking your engine off of your airplane, because that would change the entire characteristics and weight and balance of your airplane, if you would agree to that. And so always consider what you're considering when you're buying, looking at new parts. Threads don't hold up as long as the shafts do when you're looking at bolts. So that's a whole nother talk on just the bolts themselves and the science behind them. So always consider your next maintenance inspection. Who are you going to hire? Who is going to do the work? Who is your backup plan? Even if you do the work yourself. I do this all the time as a mechanic. I call my husband, I call some friends to come and look at my work, and then those same people call me to help them look at their work. We're trying to put 2 or 3 eyes on the same situation. My home builders, some of them have called on me when they wanted something, or, other mechanics. So always consider, because it's not just you that's involved. It is your life, your livelihood, and your estate, which is your family, being directly affected by your decisions. And that concludes my, talk on mechanics. And now I can take questions.
Awesome.
Right, Tamara.
Awesome. That's really good.
Here. There we go. How's that?
There you go. Yeah. We're back again.
Back. That was a very good presentation, Tamara. I always ask my guest speakers this question before we go into any other question, and that is, what is your definition of a professional pilot?
Ooh, that's a tough one. The professional pilot, I would say, doesn't dwell on their mistakes and is always tactful how they're going to address anything. But they always stand their ground.
They always what? Say that last part.
Stand their ground. If you got to say no, you got to say no. You don't let somebody talk into something you shouldn't do.
Right. So in other words, you don't allow yourself to be forced into a bad situation because of the desire to get there or get there-itis or anything like that. You're talking about, in this context, you're talking about someone saying, I got to get somewhere because I've got a funeral to go to, or I've got to go to a casino in Vegas or whatever, and the weather is crap, or not everything is working properly on the airplane in this context.
That would be in this context, yes, or sometimes just even telling them no, because you can't be the nice guy, because the nice guy sometimes gets you right in that same problem.
That's right. I like that answer. Paul, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. No worries at all. It was a great presentation, Tamara. It was really, really good. So for aircraft owners out there, what do you use to try to find a good A&P? Because you had made a comment earlier about, you different skill sets, different levels. Are there questions that you ask? Or there things that you look for when you're looking for an A&P to consider them good?
In my case, I'm sometimes questioning their knowledge that I probably already have knowledge of and seeing if it matches up to mine, or at least even if they don't know, do they admit they don't know? And are they willing to at least go get the information? Because we don't always know it all, but they're saying, hey, I know who to call. That's a big step for me. And so they kind of win me, even if they're not that great at it, because we'll work at it together at that point. But I use what we call the hive mind. I mean, nowadays with social media, it makes it even easier to ask the questions. Who do you use? Where are you going? Who did you have good luck with? So we got a lot more options than we probably did even 10, 15 years ago than we do right now.
So this is going to be kind of two questions in one. One, are you supposed to log all your maintenance? I know the answer, but I want you to say, hear it from an ANPIA. And then what can an aircraft owner who's not an AMP perform on their aircraft? What kind of maintenance can an aircraft owner perform? And where can you find the list of things that you can do as an aircraft owner?
I think that's more three questions in one. But
yeah, it is. Sorry.
You can't count, can you?
I guess not. But yeah, I just figured, it just came to mind,
No, that is a tough one. I'm going to go through the Part 91 and the Appendix D, the AC 43, looking for what is preventive maintenance that as an owner I can do, or as a pilot I can do. We're supposed to log everything. If someone overlooks logging, changing the tire, it's probably not super critical. But at the same time, they're supposed to log everything they do to this airplane. Even as a pilot, preventive maintenance, sign it with your certificate number, as well as, the date, maybe the tack time that you did it in. I think I've forgotten half of the questions that you just asked, but that's what I'm going to go for in that respect.
Well, James Clark just dropped it in the chat. All of the things out of the Part 43 Appendix A.
Appendix A. Appendix D.
Tells you what you can and can't do as an aircraft owner to an aircraft. But,
even that is sometimes convoluted. Because it's the FAA, it's convoluted anyways. So I often tell them, it says, just because the book says you can do this, you can legally change your brakes, or change a tire on your airplane, but not the brakes, but they're often tied together. So you have to remove one to get to the other. Can you change this tire? And then the next question I often ask my students, because we do have this discussion often, because they help me my students actually help me do a lot of maintenance for a learning process, is, okay, do you have the tools needed? Do you have this jack? Do you have the safety wire? Do you have the pliers? Do you have these tools? And is this, when you're going to change this tire, is it happening in your hangar where you have the tools? Or is it happening at some other airport where you no longer have the tools? So what you can do and what you may be able to do may be two different things.
Okay, and just to cite what that reg is, it's Part 43, Appendix A, subparagraph C, under preventative maintenance. That's where you find all of the things that we were just talking about. So, cool.
Yeah. The more complicated it is, the more you should probably ask your mechanic for showing you how to do it, even if the book says you can do it.
Kind of like just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, and some mechanics probably should have paid attention to that rule too, including moi. But I'm willing to learn. So I tell most people, I'm willing to learn, even if I'm not any good at it. So what other questions we got?
Paul, you're up.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just going through some of them here that are in the Q&A section here. But another one that I actually have is, in your opinion, for years of experience as a pilot and as an AP, what do you think are some of the more dangerous times whenever it goes in? Like you had mentioned that one with the Baron was in a 100-hour maintenance cycle. So whatever maintenance is done on your aircraft, when is it the most dangerous, do you think, whenever we get the airplane back from a mechanic?
Really, that very first flight is when you're probably going to discover the majority of the problems. Usually if I hit the 5 to 10 hour mark, I'm probably relaxing a little on the airplane, depending on what was done. If I had to work controls, I'm worried about it. But if it was just a normal 100-hour inspection, we didn't really find anything major on it, minor adjustments, it's probably not my biggest worry, other than, did we leave something loose? Did you leave a tool in the airplane? In this case, the 100-hour inspection in that Baron probably had nothing to do with that particular defroster hose, because it happened in the summer, actually, I believe. But it happened to break loose at that time. And how many other 100-hour inspections was it ignored, or even the annual? That's where, so really that first flight, that's why even at my school, I have a policy of, even after the first 50-hour, I do the run up the first time before I send it out with any of my instructors or solo students, because I want to be sure no anomalies show up. Still can show up at any point in time, obviously, but that first hour to 5 hours is probably your critical stage.
Okay.
That's a long-winded version of an answer.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, very good. Tamara, what's your thoughts on owner maintenance, or owner assisted maintenance, rather? Not necessarily what we were just talking about, preventative maintenance, changing tires, oil, all that stuff. But let's just say, for instance, I want to do my annual on my airplane. I'm not an AMP or an IA. What would you think about assisting me, or what have you ever considered doing that? And what would you advise someone to consider if they were going to look into doing something like that?
Well, your price just went up twice, double the cost per hour. No, I'm just kidding. And sometimes some people are not equipped to deal with that, deal with somebody either over their shoulder or training them. Being you and I are instructors, we're kind of always in that instructor mode. So I'm very willing, and me and my husband do specialize with a lot of owner assisted maintenance, or annuals and or 100-hour inspections, whatever is required. And that is because people like you want to know more about their airplanes, and they want to understand. And most of them actually probably have some interest in maintenance on the side, working on cars, working on their tractors. So it really adapts quite well into their aviation. They just got to understand there's new rules that they're not used to. Once we get them past that point, now the owner assisted annuals I don't do is the owners who are like, well, I don't need to abide by any of those rules. Okay, well, I'm not going to deal with you, and I'm going to charge you 3 times as much if you do call me. And that's just to keep them out of my hair. But I do actually love owner assisted, because you learn so much more about your airplane. And at the same time, I tell them, let's log everything you do. That way, if you ever do pursue your airframe and power plant, you have that apprenticeship records already under your belt. So, does that help?
Gotcha. Another question. Have you ever noticed any characteristics shared by great mechanics versus poor ones?
I would think that would fall similar to pilots. Your poor pilots sometimes talk really awesome about how great they are. And your really good mechanics are not talking about anything of what they can do. They're talking about somebody else, probably more than just how great their shop is and how great they are. But at the same time, There's two different levels of arrogance, both in the pilot world and the mechanic world. There's the arrogance, this, that, and how I'm going to do this, and this is how it's done. And a good one can back up that arrogance. So now you know that they can do what they say they can do. And then there's the arrogance, but then they don't have any of the skill sets and nothing shows up. It's just a bunch of empty words. So it is kind of sometimes hard to see if you are the unknowing owner or pilot that doesn't know what's going on. And I love to actually play the dumb little girl owner pilot who doesn't know anything about her airplane. It's hard to nowadays because people know who I am. But there was a time when I was 25 years old where I could bring my airplane into a shop and some mechanic that, some old white guy, as I would call him, would tell me, this and that and the other was broken. And it was like, but that was not my problem. So they'd get an education as much as I'd get an education. So I had to learn, how to play that game as well as they had to learn to suck it up when they were wrong. But arrogance runs both ways, whether it's a pilot mechanic, you will see the same traits on either end.
So let's just say I'm going to buy an airplane. And let's see, I'm in Temple, Texas, and I find, I don't know, a beautiful Seneca 2 that I want to buy up in the Northeast somewhere. It's a long way away. And I'm not an AMP or an IA or anything. What would you recommend I do for doing a pre-buy? How would you go about that if you were not a mechanic?
If you're not a mechanic, I would say hire a mechanic who has never worked on that airplane first. That's your best thing because you want a set of eyes on that airplane that has never had an interest in that airplane and not want to throw themselves under the bus. But when that's not possible, go to the next one. If you can, maybe even find somebody like me occasionally who will travel. And the other thing is I tell people, you're going to go do this pre-buy, and even I've sent a few pilots that have some mechanical background. Says, take your screwdriver, take your pliers, and go take this inspection panel off, and take pictures for me, show it to me, even if I don't get to go with you, and I will give you some tips, especially if it's one of those that it sounds too good to be true, because, we had a young lady who wanted to go look at a 150, and she went to someplace, I believe it was in Ohio, I don't remember exactly, and she's not a mechanic herself. And she didn't have and the mechanic for the airplane normally who works on this airplane, of course, was there as well as the owner of the airplane. And they kept showing her the mirror in the 150, that lovely little mirror that vibrates so bad, as well as the comfy seats and stuff, and not thinking about what she wants. And she has her screwdriver that we told her to take with her, and she wants to unscrew the panels. Of course, they didn't want her to unscrew the panels. Now, this airplane supposedly, literally a week before, just come out of annual. There was paint still on the screws. And it just come out of annual. Red flag number one. By the way, she did not buy that airplane. She actually bought something else much down the road. So it was one of those, we were able to be there with her, even though we weren't with her. So it's one of those, find your good mechanic, and ask them, what panels do I need to remove? What pictures do you want me to take? And sometimes we'll even do that online with the seller early on. And if they're not willing to share that, you don't want to look at that plane. Unless it's really, you can't pass up this kind of buy, because you could probably sell it for parts cheaper, better, for more price than you just paid for it.
Well,
Jeremy, do you have time for another question, or
no? Or is it your question or my question? I lost track.
Oh, no. I think the next one is my question. Actually.
I mean, we've got another 25 minutes. As long as Tamara is ready to.
I'm good. Yeah, I know. I just kind of rattled through my whole thing, so go for it. I got my drink. I'm good.
Oh yeah,
all right, cool.
We got the coffee, so we're good to go.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So a lot of the things that you went over in your presentation, Tamara, were hidden items, right? I mean, bolts and torque and stuff like that. So even during a pre-flight as a pilot, you probably wouldn't catch that. Is there anything that we can do? I mean, other than the owner assist maintenance, obviously, where you're actually watching them put it in there. there anything else that we can do to try to catch some of these problems?
Sometimes people might notice that prop if they notice some unusual dust, maybe if that aluminum dust I was talking about with the prop bolts, if that had started any sooner, maybe somebody would have noticed something, says that's not normal. I've never seen that on an airplane before. Anytime something doesn't look normal, I tell my students and my clients all the time, ask the question, ask a mechanic. Obviously I'm the mechanic in my case, but it says, ask us what's going on. Is this normal? Is it something I can expect? Sometimes you just see leaky spots, interesting, unusual leaky spots, and sometimes we know exactly what's causing it, and there's nothing we can do about it till we fix the prop seal on the crank on the 0235 for the 152. It's going to leak. It's going to look like a mess, and it's not really a mess because it just, oil we know gets everywhere without really being that much oil. As little things as always checking all the control movements. And even when I tell my student, says we've worked on this airplane and we may have adjusted the controls, and somebody had said something, hey, we adjusted these aileron tensions. And while you're out there working around the airplane, look inside the cockpit. Do you see things moving the way you expect to see them move? If they don't move, I've seen a 172 that came out of inspection, and I flew it. We probably flew it 5-8 hours. And the first thing we had noted, they told us at the annual, they adjusted the controls. They adjusted the cables. Okay. Well, the owner noted that they felt slightly looser, only slightly looser, but everything worked as expected. A few hours later, with a mock check ride, at one point the instructor had to take over the airplane. Again, it was my mother who had to take over the airplane because the student was making a left-hand turn, but she had full control to the right. Something was wrong. And the controls had come loose where they had adjusted them. And so it wasn't in the wing. So it's one of those, we may not even be able to see it prior, but it's one of those, you look at something, you look at a hardware. I tell my students all the time, because we teach, you and I, Jeremy, we teach people all the time to look at hardware on the control surfaces, and students don't know what they're looking for. And I love to tell them, I says, if you see a clean spot on a bolt, it's probably missing something. Because normally bolts are never cleaned very long unless it's fresh, and we never replace bolts that often. So if there's a clean spot on my bolt, it's probably missing some sort of hardware piece. Just my personal opinion. So it's looking for sometimes the little inconsistencies that you wouldn't normally see. Most people wouldn't notice a small crack, a nick, but you will feel it or you'll hear it sometimes. So open up all your senses.
This is more of an aircraft ownership question. You hear people referring to the quality of their engine on their airplane with respect to compressions. Is compressions a real good indicator of the health of the engine, or do we have to dive a little deeper?
That's a double-edged sword. Normally, I am with them in the sense that the compressions are good. But if there's an obvious bypass, because if I have an oily spark plug, that usually indicates the rings of the piston are bypassing oil of some sort. And that means that spark plug is probably not firing correctly. But like air or oil or liquid doesn't compress either, and it'll give you a really great compression number, but you're bypassing oil, so you still have the same problem of the cylinder not doing its job. So it's one of those that can be a catch-22. So you almost need a second, more information to determine if that compression is correct. Normally, yes, I would say if the compressions are good, I keep moving on. This engine is running great. But if I'm seeing oil in my spark plugs, along with really good compressions, or really awesome compressions in some cases, that's not a good indication, if that makes sense. And then that's when I'm going to dig deeper. But hey, if you get a chance to borescope, go for it. Nowadays, they make them really cheap. You can use them on your iPhone cameras or even your Droids. So go for it.
Awesome. So let me actually ask the question that I was going to ask. Whenever you get an engine that starts to get close to TBO, pilots do oil analysis. You're looking at it and you're looking for all the different metals and stuff in there. So what do you recommend the closer you get to TBO in order to make that decision to continue to move beyond TBO from an oil analysis specifically?
Well, I'd be looking for an unusual anomaly in an oil analysis. I will tell you, an oil analysis is great to tell you a trend indication, but it's not going to necessarily give you, nothing's going to tell you what's catastrophically about to happen. So if you're going to spin a bearing, one of the major bearings, something like that, it's not going to tell you, but it is telling you maybe when it's wearing down finally. I go beyond TBO quite often in an airplane as long as everything else, it's making normal power. Even if I'm not doing an oil analysis, and the oil analysis is good, but sometimes the TBO, somebody I think probably asking the question, what is a TBO? To be overhauled is what that means. And that's a recommendation by the local manufacturer, whether it's Continental 1800 or Lycoming at 2200. Everybody's got the different numbers, and each engine may have their own numbers. So under Part 91 operations, I don't have to abide by that recommendation, but any Part 141 school, 135 ops, any of the professional ops usually will abide by that, what they call a TBO number. And they just automatically do everything. I run even my flight school, I'll run past that number if everything is looking good. And even then I'll do probably what they call a top end. But metal showing up in my oil analysis is usually an indication that my cam and or lifters is probably wearing thin. And so they're finally flaking off. You'll see this a lot of times in engines that sat for a while. If you picked up an airplane that sat for 3 or 4 years or longer, that's going to be your first indication of a problem. It could happen in 100 hours. It could happen in 500 hours. That's one of those we can't predict. But that's where the oil analysis will really help you determine if that's happening sooner than later. I'm not sure if I answered that question correctly or enough, but that is my point is, I'm going to run past that TBO as long as everything else is working. I'm making the normal power. I'm making the compressions. I'm not seeing the oil problems, and I'm not seeing abnormal oil analysis unless I've done something abnormal to the airplane, like replace one cylinder, because one cylinder will throw all your numbers off until it normalizes. So always be prepared. But if the oil analysis people know that, then they adjust for that accordingly. So hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on my next question is what is too long for an airplane to sit without running?
That's a tough one. I would say 3 years, I start questioning it. When something hits past that 5-year mark, it's usually not a good sign. Not to say that I wouldn't run one, but if I'm going to buy something that's already not run, say, there's a lot of people that fly their airplanes 5-10 hours a year. That is not enough hours on an engine, even over a 10-year period. It's just not a good thing. I will consider that to be easily still not a run engine. You're going to see corrosion develop. Maybe the Continentals where the cam is down lower and the oil less so than the Lycomings where the cam is up out of the oil. Same difference though, you're still going to see problems develop. Low compression, sometimes cylinders not seating right because they've had corrosion develop. Lifters develop corrosion. It's all a major factor, but I would say after the 5th year is definitely I'm watching that engine closely. The 3rd year, and I had a 152, I got close to 500 hours after 3 years of sitting before we started flying it as a regular airplane. And that was the problem when we bought it. We knew we were buying something slightly risky. And it was a new engine. It had been recently overhauled, but it sat shortly after the break-in period for 3 years, literally not flying or running. And I will tell you, it's not the same thing to sit and run your engine for 30 minutes as it is to go fly that airplane for 30, 45 minutes. You're not getting it up to temp sitting on the ground. You're not breaking that engine in. You're not getting the oil hot enough. Go fly the airplane. And if you can't fly your airplane probably 50 hours a year, you need to rethink about your plan holding that airplane. You're killing it. You will pay for maintenance whether you fly it or you don't. And you will pay more if you don't fly it. Personal opinion.
Cool. Another personal opinion question. Are you Lena Peak or Richard Peak kind of AP, and why? We got to ask everybody the same question. It's only fair. It's only fair.
That's actually a really fair question. I am, because of the type of airplanes and the equipment I have in my airplane, I am a Richard Peak person. And that is only because one of my 152s has an EGT, but none of them have CHTs, none of them have a JPI or anything else, EI, that will tell me what my engine is actually doing. And until you can monitor all the little details, I would recommend everybody probably running on the rich side of Peak unless you have that information and understand that information. So because Richard Peak, you're less like, the only harm you're really doing is harming your plugs and your fuel burn. Whereas Lena Peak, now you're possibly hurting your cylinders and or anything else in your engine, and that's $1,000 compared to a couple $100. Big difference.
Just looking in the chat, this is a good question. So when are you allowed to fly in a GA airplane with any component over TBO, mainly in this context, the engine, and when are you not?
Anytime I'm just in a Part 91, Part 61 category type flight, flight school like I have, a Part 61 flight school, a Part 91 corporation, even, I'm allowed to go way past TBO. Personal owner or your personal airplanes, you can go way past TBOs, a lot of things, unless it's covered by an AD, or you even consider the service bulletins and mandatory service bulletins. I didn't cover that in my speak. But service bulletins were a big deal. As we saw in that one comment about the bracket on the Cessna, that Cessna sent the part even. Somebody's holding that probably in their toolbox to this day. Nobody knows what it means. Service bulletins are very, very good thing. We're not required in Part 91 to do service bulletins. Even mandatory service bulletins, we can ignore. But if you're a Part 135 operation, you are Part 121, you're a Part 119 even, anything in the commercial ops where you're monitored by the FAA, now you don't have that authority to go past those TBOs or ignore service bulletins even. And I highly recommend to owners to even seriously consider service bulletins. Now, there was a service bulletin I saw on one plane that was about, adjusting this transponder, because if you use the little mouse in this jet, it might not transmit to the transponder. Well, I never had this problem because we never used the mouse. So it wasn't that big of an issue for us. But then later down the maintenance, we made them do the service bulletin, but we waited until we went in for other maintenance to fix the problem. But we were a Part 91 op, so it didn't matter. But that mandatory service bulletin, or that service bulletin on that Cessna nose gear, even though they were Part 91, they recommended it, and it was something that the owner says, we're going to do this. So sometimes seriously consider doing it, even if it's not necessarily required, because it might be very important to the ops that you fly.
Gotcha. Is it my turn to ask a question, Jeremy?
Yeah, last question, unless Tamara's got any more.
You never know.
You might have questions for me. She might start with me.
If you think I talk a lot, you haven't met my mother.
So one last question, and actually on Cirrus airplanes, this is actually quite a serious question. where a lot of serious owners, they look at it and they say 2,000 hour TBO, right? And it's got to hit 2,000 hours. And as we all know, sometimes Continental engines just won't quite get there, right? But the owners of it wanted to get there. So they're literally, they'll almost land halfway through a flight to put oil in the engine. How do you get it through to an owner of an aircraft that engine is just 2,000 is a recommended TBO? What is something you can give them for advice to kind of help them along the line of somebody that may not be a pilot or an experienced pilot, as far as they really need to replace their engine sooner?
Well, it's kind of like I tell them sometimes, if they're not pilots themselves, maybe it's the owner of the airplane and they're hiring a pilot, someone like me, to fly their airplane or even take care of it. Is similar to their car. Does their brand new Mercedes, have certain requests to come in and do certain inspections, even if it's not required, but they probably take their car in because they want their car to run smoothly. But that doesn't mean that at 100,000 miles, according to the government, your car is obsolete. It's no good anymore. It's beyond its working limits. And we all know that some of these cars are 300, 400,000 miles and still working great. So my airplane is the same way. If I have done my good maintenance, the oil changes on a frequent basis, and the checking all the little details and taking care of all the little maintenance, it's probably going to go well beyond the supposed limits, the same as my car. So sometimes, like any good instructor, we got to relate it to something they already know, and in this case, probably their car.
Gotcha. Okay, sounds good. Jeremy, it's all yours. You have the controls again, sir.
All right. Well, real quick, Tamara, do you have any closing comments? Last word before I close this out.
Not really. I think I covered it all. Just don't F it up. And don't call me when you do.
Well, Tamara, we've talked a little bit about the seaplane stuff. We'll go splash around when we get an opportunity to, because I've kind of got a thing for flying float planes, and once you go to start splashing around in the water, it's like addictive. It's the best fun I think I've ever had.
So once you go floats, you can't go back?
What's that?
So once you go floats, you can't ever go back?
That's it. We're pilots, guys. Pilots are nerds. Just all it is to it. We're born nerds. That's it.
Look up those multi-engine seaplanes, though.
Yeah. Tamara, thanks again, and I really appreciate it. Everybody, please give her a round of applause. And thanks again. I'm going to close us out real quick. Thanks again, everybody. This program is only successful because of you. We are growing this program. We've got things in the works for 2021. We've got guest speakers lined up all the way through March. And we are going to expand and branch out our footprint from just not only aviation safety, but history, adventure, and some other types of stuff along the way. We may even do some last minute, off the cuff, breaking the chain episodes here and there. And I might send out an email with 2 days notice. We've got some things in the works right now, which is really cool. Like I said, this program is only successful because of you. Spread the word, invite your friends to come be a part of this program, because that's how we're going to continue to grow it. It's a nonprofit deal. You come, you learn, and we take things away. Send me a note at flyalallamerican@gmail.com. Ask questions, talk to me, get to know me. I love the interaction. Go ahead and follow me on YouTube and Instagram and on Facebook. And then, and I was kind of touching on this just a minute ago, but on December 15th, I'm going to present the last break in the chain of 2020. So we've got 2 more left. We got one coming up on December the 1st, and then one on December 15th. December 15th, I'm going to talk about the new vision of breaking the chain. I'll be the presenter. And then join us at 7:30 on December the 1st, as we have repeated offender, JP Dice, our weatherman from Birmingham, Alabama, come back, and he's going to talk about winter weather flying activities. With that being said, guys and gals, nothing is stronger than the heart of a volunteer. General James Doolittle. From Paul and I and Tamara, have a wonderful evening. Fly safe, keep learning, and never give up on a dream. So long.